Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for our Hard Histories book talk with Dr. William Thomas. My name is Ellie Palazzolo, and I'm a graduate student in the history department, working broadly in the 18th and 19th century United States. My research interests focused around food, family, gender, and memory during the Civil War, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow eras. Launched in fall 2020, the Hard Histories at Hopkins project examines the role that racism and discrimination have played at Johns Hopkins, blending research, teaching, public engagement, and the creative arts. Hard Histories aims to engage our broadest communities at Johns Hopkins and in Baltimore in a frank and informed exploration of the myths that have become part of our university story, and to offer evidence of how race and racism have shaped Johns Hopkins. In spring 2021, we are hosting a series of book discussions that feature scholars on the histories of slavery and racism in Baltimore and Maryland. Today, we are excited to host the second such discussion. We invite our panelists now to turn their cameras on. We are honored to have with us for our conversation Dr. William Thomas and his book, A Question of Freedom, The Families Who Challenged Slavery from the Nation's Founding to the Civil War, which just came out from Yale University Press in 2020. Dr. Thomas's book explores the lives and experiences of enslaved individuals who sued for freedom in Maryland and Washington, D.C. in the late 18th and 19th centuries. Centering the stories and freedom suits of Edward Queen, Charles Mahoney, and their families in White Marsh, Prince George's County, Thomas asks questions of the meaning and practices of freedom at the turn of the 19th century. His book is also a meditation on coming to terms with the difficult realization of a personal connection to slavery in Maryland upon learning that some of his ancestors had enslaved people on neighboring plantations. As such, A Question of Freedom raises broader questions about reckoning and reconciliation surrounding JHU's relationship with slavery and its long-lasting afterlife. Dr. Thomas is the Engel Chair in the Humanities and Professor of History at the University of Nebraska, and the author of 3 books. He was co-founder and director of the Virginia Center for Digital History at the University of Virginia. A Guggenheim Fellow and a Lincoln Prize finalist, he has collaborated across disciplines to create imaginative forms of history, including an online archive of freedom suits in the nation's capital, available at earlywashingtondc.org. Dr. Thomas will be in conversation with Hard Histories Project Director, Dr. Martha S. Jones. Dr. Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor, Professor of History, and a professor at the S&F Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Thomas and Dr. Jones will be in conversation for about 25 minutes, then we'll turn to your questions. Please submit your questions at any time using the Q&A function. Finally, live captioning is available directly through Zoom. For those who prefer to access captions online, the link has been posted in the chat. Thank you both for being here. I will now turn the conversation over to Dr. Jones and see you all at the end of the discussion.
Thank you so much, Ellie. We really appreciate you being here, and welcome to those of you who have been with us for this series and those of you who are newcomers. Welcome to Hard Histories at Hopkins and this conversation with Dr. William Thomas. Dr. Thomas, I want to start with a thank you for this book, which I'm very pleased to hold up if I can get it to sit just right on the Zoom. This beautiful book. It's already being recognized with awards, and so congratulations on that. But for our community, you've really opened up a remarkable window, I think, onto how enslaved people in Maryland resisted enslavement, but also how white Marylanders, in a sense, resisted those efforts toward freedom. It won't come to you, I don't think, as a surprise that I was especially fascinated with how courthouses and lawyers and judges and juries were both allies and adversaries in this story, working both sides on the question of slavery and freedom. But I do think that where you wind up in this story, confronting your own family's role in enslavement, and at the same time, you join in community with the descendants of the enslaved people who were part of your history. It makes this a history with, I think, an explicit relevance for our community, but for our own time. You know that our work at Hard Histories is in part aimed at helping the Johns Hopkins community and the Baltimore community engage in a reckoning with our past. And I think for me, A Question of Freedom is a model for how to do that. And we recognize and admire you for the journey that you took, one part of which was deeply archival, and we'll get to talk about that. But the other part of which took you to a place that I'll dare term reparations. It's not lost on me that the royalties for this book are going directly to support the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. That organization is headed by Baltimore's own Sherilyn Ifill, who herself is a scholar of racial reckoning. And I found the resonances between your study and her book On the Courthouse Lawn, which looks at how Marylanders struggle until today with the history of lynching, as tragically companion stories. And so you've really created, helped to create a new bibliography, I think, for us, a new reading list for us, a new syllabus for us here. And we're really, really grateful. So let me dive in because we have a lot of questions, and I want to remind folks that they can drop questions in the Q&A function, and I will have the pleasure of sharing those with Dr. Thomas. So please, at any point that the spirit moves you, drop those questions there and they will get to me. So maybe I could start, Dr. Thomas, just with asking you, in a sense, to sketch out the story. Now, I know that's a formidable ask in a book that is epic. That is to say, the book that stretches from the establishment of Maryland as a colony to the present. But for those who have only started to read the book, I thought it might be worthwhile to start just asking you to help orient us, and then we'll dive into some of the particulars. And again, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Jones, and thank you to the whole team at Johns Hopkins for inviting me to this Hard Histories discussion and talk. I'm thrilled to be here and to talk about A Question of Freedom. At the center of this book is a freedom suit called Queen V Hepburn, and this freedom suit came before the United States Supreme Court in 1813. And it involved a family, the Queen family, who were suing for their freedom against a slaveholder named John Hepburn. And it's a widely cited decision. It's one of the most important cases that defined the hearsay rule in American law. And I had stumbled upon a reference to Queen V Hepburn. And because it was a freedom suit, and I didn't know much about freedom suits other than Dred Scott, especially freedom suits that early in American history. I decided to go to the National Archives and look into this, but there were other reasons. Francis Scott Key, a prominent Marylander, was the attorney for the Queens, and he gave the argument at the Supreme Court in 1813. And so when I went to the National Archives and pulled the case files for Queen V Hepburn, it became apparent that there were other freedom suits by the Queens, including Priscilla Queen's freedom suit against the Reverend Francis Neal, and he was in 1810 the president of Georgetown College. And so here, what I thought was one freedom suit was actually two important freedom suits. And then even further, there were three other Queen freedom suits filed in that same term in June of 1810. And so what I thought was one freedom suit was really a whole set of freedom suits by the Queen family. And when I looked into this a little further and began pulling the threads of the freedom suits wherever they led, back in time, the Queen family's history, and forward in time, what happened to them after the Supreme Court decision, it became clear that all the evidence that they used in 1810 came from freedom suits by the Queen family in the 1790s in Maryland. And not only that, but the Queens were not the only family to sue for freedom. The Mahoneys sued for freedom. The Shorters sued for freedom. The Butlers sued for freedom. The Thomases and others. and so, so again, what I thought was one freedom suit really was the tip of the iceberg, if you will. There were hundreds of freedom suits against slaveholders. Most of the prominent slaveholders in Maryland were sued, and the story really begins with the Queen and Mahoney freedom suits against the Jesuits in 1791. So this book begins with those two important freedom suits, and it follows the trajectory of the freedom suits through Queen V Hepburn, this critical Supreme Court decision, and then beyond Queen V Hepburn to the Civil War. And what I wanted to do is tell the story of the families who challenged slavery and who used the law to challenge slavery.
It's a vivid lesson in what I think of as the way in which, you know, the archives speak to us and dictate to us where we're actually headed. We show up at the Library of Congress with a question and find the archives and pulling on us, right, and posing questions to us, and all of a sudden we are in places, in stories, in sagas that I think you have not only explored deeply, but you framed importantly through the rubric of family.
Right.
You know, when you and I met, I was pulling on some threads on the story of the Hopkins family, their slaveholding, their indentureship of free Black children. And when I finally had a chance to read this book, A Question of Freedom, I was struck by how my questions emanated out of a focus on a slaveholding family. But your research really took a different perspective, that of enslaved families. And you know that we oftentimes encounter enslaved people in the archives as sort of atomized or disaggregated individuals, right? Their entries on a census return or names on estate inventories, lone figures even getting manumission papers or freedom papers. But you, I think, insisted that these were families and extended families
Yes.
across vast networks of lineage, but vast networks of space. And I guess I want to ask you to comment on why it was important to take that perspective. You know, a legal historian, another kind of legal historian, could have written the story of Queen V Hepburn from the perspective of those sitting on the bench in Washington on the Supreme Court. And you didn't do that. But I think we need to understand better why.
Yeah, there's no doubt that Queen V Hepburn, with Francis Scott Key in the picture, and with Supreme Court Justice Gabriel Duvall's dissent in the case, in which he says, it will be universally admitted that the right of freedom is more important than the right to property. And that there's certainly a story that could be centered on Duvall and Key and the justices and John Marshall's majority opinion that renders all this evidence, all this secondhand testimony, this hearsay from really oral histories of the Queen family, renders all those oral histories inadmissible in a U.S. court of law. And strikingly, the only words of recorded, essentially, of the Queen ancestor, Mary Queen, the only words that made it through the generations are stricken from the record and not considered valid in court. And so, so at the center of the hearsay rule is this monstrous injustice and this historic erasure, this genealogical erasure of these families. And so I think, you know, this is true also of the printed records of the Cranch, of the volumes of the printed records of legal history. Dr. Jones, you know these well. We consult these often. They're these printed volumes of case reports. And in almost all of those, the last names of the enslaved are removed. But if you go to the archival record in the National Archives or in the Maryland State Archives in Annapolis for the Maryland cases, the names that the families used themselves are fully present in that paper record, that archival record. And so, these families were at the center of the story of American freedom, and in a way that we've not acknowledged. And I wanted in this book to place the families right at the center of the story of American freedom and of American history. They bring freedom suits across numerous generations. And, I think one of the issues we have right now in thinking about United States history and the history of slavery is that, as you just put it, it's often depicted in nameless and faceless ways. So there are a few single individuals, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, for example, but families are almost never mentioned in our history textbooks. And it seemed to me that what the Mahoney family did in carrying out a 12-year litigation across 3 jury trials and 2 appeals to the Maryland High Court was an extraordinary act of raising the moral problem of slavery in the law in American courts. And they relied on their family lineage and their family knowledge and their family sense of belonging and citizenship to carry out this incredible effort.
I want to drill in on the freedom suits because you just emphasized the ways in which these families, the Queen family, the Mahoney family, and more in Maryland are raising the moral questions about slavery for the nation through the freedom suits. But I think it's fair to say they're also raising the legal questions about slavery, which is to say that you make it plain, right, that sort of what undergirds many of these suits is the degree to which there is an open question about whether, in fact, enslavement itself is legal in Maryland. Now, right. I want to take you to one of the things you said in an interview that I listened to this morning. Okay. And you said you read 1,000 freedom suits during the course of your research. That tells us so much. I'm familiar with the Dred Scott context, and historians like Leah Vandevelde and Kelly Kennington have told us Dred Scott in the 1850s is the last one of the last in a string of 350 or so cases that were brought in the state of Missouri. But you read 1,000, and that, to me, just that number alone tells us something new, I think, about how enslaved people managed to make their way to court, secure lawyers in many cases, make arguments ultimately about how they were being wrongly held. It reminds me of a debate that I have long been a part of with colleagues about things like census returns and estate inventories. That for every person denoted on those documents, we have to be open to the possibility, right, that were we to interview them, they would tell us that in fact they had a claim to freedom, right? That that those entries are arguments, they're claims, they're not facts. And I feel like your work made that so vivid for me. So can you tell us a little bit more about how you go about reading freedom suits and sort of making sense out of them. You've already talked about going from the published record, which is what we encounter as law students and in law libraries, that these are the polished writings of high court judges. There's the trial record, right, which is richer still and much more varied. But this is still just the starting place in the kind of research you do to finally make sense of these court cases. What is that kind of journey like?
Well,
I know
one of
it's
the
arduous. I just want to say I know it's arduous, but
yeah,
it's also fascinating.
it is. It is. One of the things that gradually I realized in researching and writing this book is that, and I came to the conclusion that slavery was contested. It was not stable in the law, and the freedom suits are a testament to that, and were designed, I think, by the enslaved families to challenge the legitimacy, the so-called legitimacy of slavery as a lawful institution. In other words, we often think of slavery in the law as somehow stable, as unyielding, as kind of implacable, and that it was made by slaveholders and in contradiction with liberalism, but it was somehow stable. And I think that, you know, from day one of the United States and before, slavery was challenged. It was contested. It was not stable. And the freedom suits tell the story, I think, of this instability, that in fact, slaveholders attempted to inscribe into the law the idea that there could be such a thing as human property, that the law could somehow sanction a property right in people. And this contest over this issue was not resolved in I don't know, 1776 or in 1783, or it was a contest that had also taken place in English courts across the 17th and 18th centuries. And so these freedom suits were an extension of that, because in fact, in the Queen and in the Mahoney cases, they rested on the argument that their ancestor was a free woman because she had set foot in England. And under English common law, slavery was incompatible with English common law. So the consequences, the effects of these freedom suits were momentous and had potential to destabilize slavery and continue that line of legal argument from England into Maryland courts. You know, you asked about the archival work of the freedom suits, and most of what is contained in these records are depositions, are statements, sworn statements by white and free Black witnesses who are testifying to the status of the ancestor of the Queens or the ancestor of the Mahoneys. And in some cases, the ancestor was a white woman, and the argument was that she was a free white woman, and her descendants should be free as a consequence. But in the Queen and in the Mahoney cases, the ancestor in question was a free woman of color. And so this really gets to the heart of the legal challenge that these cases brought into Maryland. Reading these depositions, you know, and there are hundreds of them. I guess I'd point out two things. One is the presence of free Black witnesses. They are testifying to the genealogies of these families, and these are elaborate genealogies repetitively inscribed in the record for the court. And so they're vital to these claims. And the other is that, and it took me a long time to realize this, I'd read a lot of depositions, and I was thinking about, and Dr. Jones, I'm sure you're also thinking about this issue of the silences in the archive. Historians are confronted with an archive that is just a remnant, a shard of pieces of the past. And how do we hear the voice of Charles Mahoney? How do we hear the voice of Edward Queen or Priscilla Queen? There are lawyers' arguments, and we certainly have those. But in these depositions, at one point I finally realized that Charles Mahoney was present when the depositions were taken. In fact, the deposition at the bottom says that this deposition was taken, quote, at the request of Charles Mahoney, who was present, end quote. And so this radically transformed the way I thought about the freedom suits. Here's just this small notation in the archive in a deposition, but so full of meaning. He was present, physically present. He was in control of this litigation. He sought out witnesses. He identified witnesses who would have been able to testify to the status of his grandmother and great-grandmother. And he was present. And other enslaved petitioners who were also present at these depositions, and there were dozens of these depositions being taken, intervened and actually questioned slaveholders about particular points, specific points of their family or the genealogy. And so here's a moment of incredible significance that an enslaved person would question a slaveholder under the law, on the record. So I think the archival evidence, while difficult to sort through, tells us so much about the courage, the determination, and the importance of these families and the suits that they brought.
Your point about the role that now, as these families are being transformed through freedom suits, increasingly the role that free members of those families are going to play in continuing this story. And I think one of the things that might surprise some readers is that, in a sense, in a place like Maryland, the problem of slavery and the possibility of freedom is just, in a sense, the beginning of the story. You introduce us to a Maryland that is deeply enmeshed in the colonization movement. And I'll ask you to say a little bit more about what colonization is. But here we know that formerly enslaved people, free Black Marylanders, became subject to a scheme that, once they achieved their freedom, aimed to, in essence, remove them from the state or remove them from the country. In my archives, it often is termed anti-free Negroism, right? It grows up alongside slavery.
Right.
And so can you sort of take us forward and tell us how colonization and Black laws, what are the lives like for these folks who have now done this extraordinary work, as you've described it, of winning their freedom, wresting their freedom, right, away from slaveholders, only to find themselves in the grips of colonization?
Right. Well, the American Colonization Society is founded in 1816, so right on the heels of Queen V Hepburn. And I do think it's significant that, you know, Francis Scott Key is the attorney in Queen V Hepburn for the Queens, makes an argument about hearsay evidence as the best evidence that could possibly be collected, the only evidence for freedom that could possibly be collected. And he, but he's also a a founder of the American Colonization Society. And so in this period of the 18 teens, Key and Henry Clay and others, powerful political figures, found this colonization society whose aim is really to remove Black people from the United States. It is to remove those freed to Africa. And so colonization means colonizing a new colony of African Americans to Africa. And beginning in 1816, this effort is to raise money and to organize the expatriation, the removal, effectively. And Dr. Jones, you write about this in Birthright Citizens, actually, in a very important way. And so I want to acknowledge your scholarship in this area of the 1830s and the way in which colonization becomes linked with a lot of other forms of removal, like Indian removal. And so this effort of Key and others is to sort of, Key and reformers like Key seek to end the slave trade they see it as a sin. I mean, I think we can take Key at his word on that, but he can see no way for Black freedom to succeed, even though it's succeeding all around him. And eventually, in the 1830s, he simply publicly disavows the idea of Black freedom. And so I think the story here is an extraordinarily complex one of the way white slaveholders both defended the institution of slavery and when confronted with Black freedom, sought to remove Black freedom from their society.
In a moment, I'm going to turn to questions from our audience, which are filling my queue. But let me ask one more question before I turn to them, if I could.
Sure.
And it is ultimately, I think, about the way, you used the phrase moral problem when speaking about the enslaved litigants in these cases. But part of what's remarkable about this book is that you yourself, I think, firmly take up the moral problem of slavery and its legacy for yourself. And, there are places in the world, France, for example, where slavery and the slave trade have been deemed crimes against humanity. Closer to home, here in Maryland in 2007, lawmakers passed a resolution that expressed a regret for the role that Maryland had played in instituting and maintaining slavery and for the discrimination that was slavery's legacy. Some people would say historians should play a different role than do politicians or lawmakers when it comes to reckoning with slavery. And I'd be interested in just hearing you talk a little bit about the way I think about it, and you'll tell me if I'm reading you correctly, is about the way in which writing this book perhaps changes you on that score, that you yourself take a journey. I mean, there's one passage that stood out for me. You're writing about your own family, its slaveholding, and I think you come very close to a kind of condemnation of their presumptions of racial superiority and their bland willingness to sell anyone they deemed necessary. So I wonder if you could just talk with us a bit about how writing this book changed you, because I think that we don't always expect that from historians. We expect lots of new knowledge, but rarely do we glimpse the way in which the historian, him or herself, has been changed by the process of the research and the writing, and a great deal more that you did in connection with producing this book.
Sure. Well, the more I researched this subject, I mean, I knew that one part of my family, the Duckett part of my families, were in Prince George's County, and I knew that they were lawyers, and I knew some of them were judges, and I certainly knew that they were likely slaveholders, that many of them were probably slaveholders. Certainly, Prince George's County was a slaveholders county right on through the early 19th century. And but as I worked on the freedom suits and began to pull at the threads we were talking about, to follow them wherever they led, it became clear that some of my Duckett ancestors were more closely connected to this story than I ever would have thought or realized. One of them was a judge in the local Prince George's County court, and the Queen freedom suits came before his court, and 24 or so Queen family members won their freedom that day in Thomas Duckett's court. He let in all the hearsay evidence. We have no idea why he did that. Partly he was not really a trained lawyer. He was a judge who was appointed because of his social standing, probably, to the court. And so, and certainly hearsay evidence was being allowed in lots of other freedom suits, including Edward Queen's suits. So he was really just following what the General Court of the Western Shore had done in Annapolis. His son gets his start as a lawyer representing the Jesuits, and I did not know this, against the freedom suit petitioners. And so, the more I researched, the more I was coming to terms with my family's history. And I think as I talked with descendants of the families who sued for freedom, the Queen descendants, the Mahoney descendants, it became clear that this is a painful present history. This is not a history of 240 years ago. And as a historian, I felt the past brushing up to the present at every step on this journey that you just referred to. And so I wanted to write, I felt obligated, really, to write this history in a way that would make it clear to readers that the past is close to us. It's proximate, it's felt, it's experienced by people today. And I wanted to acknowledge that and bring that bring that forward for readers. I mean, I think we're obligated to know the full history, the complete history of the nation, and to acknowledge the way that history has shaped our present circumstances. And so I hope that I can be a guide through that reckoning. And I hope that readers will come along with me on that encounter with the past, which is not so past, it's present.
Mm-hmm. No, I'm remembering when, and you might remember this, when shortly after Barack Obama took office, a genealogist, unbeknownst to the new president, did a version of his so-called family tree, and found there both enslaved people, but found slaveholders.
Yes, in Prince George's County.
And what I remember Barack Obama saying is, well, that's American history, right? That is American history. And I've never forgotten that, right? As I think a really important framing for this. So people have a lot of questions about these freedom suits. So let me try and consolidate a couple. On the one hand, people would like to know more about how it is that enslaved people get access to lawyers and to courts. I think it defies maybe our common sense that would place enslaved people outside of the courthouse. And then a question about sort of the trajectory of freedom suits across the course, the course of your study, which is to say, is there a turning point like Queen V Hepburn where the fate of freedom suits really takes a turn?
Yes. The question of access is one that I really looked into. How did enslaved people gain access to lawyers, to the courts? How did they bring these freedom suits? How did they have standing? I think, first of all, that in Maryland in particular, we have to remember that these families were 3, 4, and 5 generations deep in Maryland. And in the 1790s in Maryland, these enslaved families had many connections, many experiences that would bring them in. They had lived through the American Revolution, the Constitutional Convention. They were connected to Annapolis, to Upper Marlboro, to the county courthouse in Prince George's, and eventually to Washington, D.C. And so I think it requires rethinking how we approach enslaved families and their significance as reservoirs, as repositories, as living embodiments of knowledge, legal knowledge, political knowledge. These were political acts, and these were political actors. Charles Mahoney, I think, is a political actor in Maryland of the most of the highest significance. And so there's no doubt that Gabriel Duvall, who files many of these freedom suits, is right there in Prince George's County, not far from White Marsh Plantation, where the Queens and Mahoneys are enslaved. It's reasonable to infer that they would have access to him, that they would know him, his family, his activity. So I think it really asks us to rethink our assumptions about slavery as and how enslaved families experienced slavery. So there's no doubt that some attorneys take up these cases as pro bono cases, but I found no evidence of that, really. I could not find evidence that, Francis Scott Key took these as pro bono. There's a few oblique references. I think many of these families, particularly in the 1830s and 40s in Washington, D.C., knew the network of attorneys. They talked, Daniel Bell worked at the Washington Navy Yard, right, with 3 enslaved men who each had sued for freedom at different points. So they literally pounded anchors together in the blacksmith shop. I think they talked about this. And so we want to really make room in our historical understanding for the complex social interactions that enslaved people had with free Black people, with white people, with slaveholders, with non-slaveholders. So it's recovering, I think, that complexity and that knowledge that enslaved families possessed and they maintained over generations.
Thank you for that. One of our questions asks you to help think comparatively about the story that you tell. Across human history, there are many systems of enslavement. But I think part of what you help us think about really importantly is what happens in part by way of the American Revolution that leads to both a carryover and a disjuncture between a state like Maryland and the one-time metropole of London. the story lets us glimpse that, but maybe it's a bigger question about the role of comparative history, but how comparative history works in your story.
Well, I think one of the reasons I wrote the book the way I did was I'm concerned about some ideas that we have, many folks have, about the founding as somehow predetermined or as an inevitable flourishing of liberty. And in that account, comparatively speaking, slavery is portrayed as incidental to the revolution. It's sort of, it seems in that account, it's incidental to the course of the nation's history. And the freedom suits immediately tell us a different story, a story of Maryland's and the United States break with the imperial British system. And slavery, therefore, is not some vestige bound to disappear, but despite its obvious incompatibility with the founding principles, what we have to figure out is how it gained sanction, it gained legitimacy within the law and the constitutional system in the United States. And so the comparative view helps us see that, and helps us see that, in fact, Somerset v. Stewart in 1772 had tremendous significance, recursive significance in the new Republic of the United States, where the Queens and the Mahoneys really are placing the question of slavery in front of the courts of Maryland, in the same way that Quock Walker placed the question of freedom in front of Massachusetts. Massachusetts ended slavery not by constitutional passage, but through a court decision. And so, the comparative relationship between English law and English precedent and what was happening in the United States is one that we really need in order to understand what was at stake in Queen V Hepburn and other freedom suits.
And I think that tension between everything from, as you point out, the Haitian Revolution,
Yes.
France's abolition of slavery, to British abolition, Gran Colombia, all of those pressures are both being felt and I think resisted in a place like Maryland, where, among other things, the Port of Baltimore is bringing in folks who have deep and extensive knowledge about the way in which slavery is transforming and being challenged throughout the hemisphere.
Right, and let me just add one other piece of that, Dr. Jones, because it really builds on your point. Early on, these freedom suits are occurring in a very public and political setting. When I first started researching this, I didn't realize that the freedom suits in the general court were heard right in the State House of Maryland, right in the Great Hall. And so in Annapolis. So these were public events. And right before Edward Queen's case, there is in fact a case of from a Haitian white slaveholding French planter who seeks to hold on to a man named Hector and enslave him. And the circulation of the ideas of freedom that you just described is literally happening right in the Great Hall of Annapolis in the State House. And so it changes the way we think about the comparative, the relationship between the Haitian Revolution and the American Revolution and its effects.
I don't know the answer to this question, but it's posed here, and I think it's an important way of sort of building out off of your study. It in part asks, what were the major legal impediments, to legal access for those enslaved people who did not obtain their freedom. I guess what I would add to that is, how do you think about or account for people who don't make it to the courthouse, who don't secure a lawyer? Is there another, it's another book, but is there another book to be written, that story about folks who don't make it?
Oh, I think I think so. Well, in at least in this story, in A Question of Freedom, the enslaved people who, for a variety of reasons, are unsuccessful in their freedom suits, and many were successful. I mean, that is one of the remarkable stories here, is more than 50% of all the cases I looked at were successful, for which we know an outcome. But for those who were not, and most prominently in this history, the Bell family and its struggle for freedom in the 1830s and 40s, the consequences and the consequences were often the breakup of the family, the sale of enslaved families, and the to Louisiana, just as Georgetown and the Jesuits did in 1838. So the story that you're talking about is a story of fracture, is a story of resistance to that splintering, resistance to the uprooting, but uprooting nonetheless. And the story of the rise of, and I try to account for this, an interstate domestic slave trade that removes over 1 million men, women, and children from the region of Maryland and Washington, D.C. and Virginia. And so this is a part of American history that we need to come to terms with, the interstate domestic slave trade and the destruction of families through it.
Thank you for that. And I will mention that during our next book talk event coming up in a couple of weeks, Jenny Williams, a new PhD from our own history department, will be with us to talk about her very important work on the domestic slave trade. Mm-hmm. I have one more minute. Okay. So maybe I'll ask you this, which is, what is next for you?
Well,
your breath from this, and you're still.
Yeah. I'm certainly gonna take a breath. I'm actually looking at the story that follows, and I'm interested in the building of banks and bank institutions in Washington, D.C. and Maryland, and the development of Black landholding and property holding and wealth accumulation. I am interested in not only what happens to these families, but indeed into the 20th century, the issue of wealth accumulation in American history.
Dr. Thomas, I want to thank you. Thank you again for this book, which I have already myself read twice, and our students are already deeply engaged with. But I think on behalf of everybody who's tuned in today, I want to say thank you for the book, for the stories that you tell, but also for the way in which you really help us appreciate the present day reckoning that is a companion to the telling of these stories of these extraordinary families and their struggles for freedom, for citizenship, and a great deal more across many generations. I want to thank folks who have tuned in, and with that, I'm going to pass it back to Ellie, who's going to wrap things up for us. Thank you, Ellie.
Thank you.
Thanks very much to Dr. Jones and Dr. Thomas for this incredibly rich conversation. Dr. Thomas, we're really honored to have had you here and appreciate how your research sheds light on the questions that we're asking at the Hard Histories at Hopkins project. For me, your conversation has invited thinking more about the importance of understanding actors, trends, and events in and beyond Maryland in order to gain a richer understanding of local, intimate, and in our case, institutional histories. Listening to you all talk has also made me think further about the contingency, potential, and challenges of working in and around a legal archive generally, and specifically freedom suits and family archives. And then finally, Dr. Thomas, your remarks have really inspired me to think more deeply about thinking and writing about the past, to borrow some of your words, as painful, proximate, felt, experienced, and very much present today. So thank you. And thanks also to our audience for watching and for sending in your great questions, and to the team at the SNF Agora Institute for supporting the event. During these book conversations, we have the chance to share what we're reading. We're also interested in what you're reading. What sources have helped you better understand the hard questions that we are asking at the Hard Histories project? Share them with us and help build our collective Hard Histories bibliography. Let other members of the Hopkins and Baltimore community know about these books and articles that are helping you sort through the history of enslavement and more. You can reach us on social media with the hashtag JHU Hard Histories, or at our website where you can leave us a message. We look forward to hearing from you and learning from you too. Finally, please plan to join us on Thursday, April 15th from 12 noon to 1 p.m. Eastern for our next Hard Histories event, which Dr. Jones has previewed for us, featuring Dr. Tony Perry and Dr. Jenny Williams. You can learn more about Hard History at Hopkins at hardhistory.jhu.edu. Additional information about our event series is posted at snfagora.jhu.edu/event. Thank you and have a great rest of the day.